Yeah. There's no I guess like movement across time, as in Erickson's model. Erickson's model is uh like a hallmark of psychosocial development. Do you want to touch on his stages real quick?
Yeah, so we talked about Erickson at absolute length in development, so I won't go too far. But the
Hmm.
thing to remember at Erickson is Erickson took the ideas of Anna Freud, not Sigmund Freud. So ego psychology,
Yeah.
okay, the thought about present ego, conscious self as a determinant of who we are and who we become, and then ran with that. So Adler's work and Erickson's work very much complement each other, where each one of them is looking at social phenomenon and how they grow. What Erickson did is he was more of a developmentalist. So he placed each one of these different social motivations within context in a stage, which is really why we talk about him more and why his theory is a little bit more powerful, right? So at each stage, we have these inner tensions working with the external context and environment we're sitting in. And through that, we find growth. Uh,
And the other coin of that growth, like through we find growth, is if we can't complete each stage properly, it's somewhat like a baggage that we're carrying with ourselves. And it's like this like continual addition of struggle, like this crises, I guess you could say.
yeah, epigenetic principle, right? That
Yeah.
what happens in early stages sets up what can in later stages. Those core pathologies. So, like if you can't necessarily find uh, balance within the stage, uh,
Hmm.
you have to cope with it. And if the balance is so overwhelming, you probably are going to cope with it poorly. So you have this coping strategy that's not going to work for the
Hmm.
rest of your life that you have to find to overcome, right? So like right now, like I'm a mess.
Hmm.
Like we were talking before this, like I'm at my like meltdown point, like of overwhelmment. Like I'm my brain's toast.
Yeah.
Right? And so what do I do? I tend to enjoy food, so I'll eat like food that's bad for me. It's a bad coping strategy.
Yeah.
Right? It takes a lot to get past that.
Yep.
Those are things that we adopt and have to overcome. And so Erickson placed those in. And Erickson's theory is very much a theory of personality as much as it's a theory of development.
Now let's talk a little bit about Jung. And Jung is probably my favorite. Uh, Mainly, like I always like to use this. I didn't coin this. This is coined by Jordan Peterson. That Sigmund Freud kind of dug into the basement of the brain, and then Carl Jung dug many basements into the basement of the brain. And so Carl Jung really talked through archetypes. This is more symbolic, right?
Yeah. Archetypes are patterns that exist within kind of collective uh, culture. Um, the most famous way you've probably seen archetypes play out, um,
Is
you know,
Disney. I mean, I say Disney. I say Disney because it's somewhat, I guess, relatable to our generation. I guess you could say archetype as in like any hero story, like David and Goliath,
yeah,
any Greek mythology in general. I guess you could say.
yeah, and that's where most people start coming to understand archetypes is like the hero story, right?
Hmm.
And all of that work which you learn in English. Now, what that means and what we get into with kind of collective unconsciousness, collective archetypes is when you break things down far enough, and this is what Peterson was referencing. When
Hmm.
you break things down far enough with enough abstraction, you can connect anything.
Hmm.
And so, Peterson and many of us, really love this idea of creating abstraction because then you can start uncovering all of the similarities between things. And that's what Jung really did by digging deep.
Hmm.
He was looking for what are the patterns, what's the underlying structure that creates the structure of the structure you see, right? And so he was very much in that third tier of abstraction,
Yeah.
that philosophical world. and probably more than any other psychologist, kind of showed us why we're called doctors of philosophy and
Mm-hmm.
not doctors of psychology.
Yeah.
Philosophers. Our idea is to look at how things are created. Yeah, and so Jung just kind of did it, right?
Yeah.
The cool thing that I love about Jung is when he talks about self-realization of an unconscious archetype, like that freedom moment. And we talk about this often in college, that freedom moment of when you figure out who you are as a basis of what you've seen. Like you can only become things that you are aware of. You pick up things that you aren't necessarily aware of too and merge it in. Just until you become aware of them, you don't realize that they're a part there, right?
Yeah.
And so once you become aware of them, you can become those things too. And this is what Jung was talking about in a lot of his theory.
Well,
Uh,
a lot of that talks about aim, right?
yeah, yeah.
Like,
And so think about Adler's work,
yeah.
right? Of those social motivations. Like it all comes together, and you're like
Yeah.
sitting there, and you're like, "Oh, this shit's exciting!"
Yeah.
Like like it just I don't know. Like this is the fun part of psychology for a lot of us. Your brain just starts twisting, and you get little feeds from everybody in there.
Mm-hmm.
And so that brings us back to this kind of persona,
Mm-hmm.
our collective understanding of others and our understanding of our own experiences bring us to figure out how we are in our true self and then what society expects us to be. And our consciousness creates a bridge between those things, a presentation of ourself that is as close to our true self as possible while managing the expectations of society.
Mm-hmm.
And so in any moment, we may not be our true self because we are still learning how to.
I mean, like a great example is like you a great example is you swear around your friends, but you don't swear around your grandmother.
Right.
Like that's like such a generic good example of that.
Because grandma can't see who you really are because it would make grandma afraid.
Yeah, it would like make grandma think that you're like the next Hitler or something.
Well, so why? Because the collective unconsciousness, the
Mm-hmm.
archetypes that existed within grandma's generation
Mm-hmm.
don't exist anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And in order for her to understand the you are in the way you are, she would have to update all of her understandings of these new archetypal ways. And not everybody, again, to go back to that graph,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that chart, not everybody is that person who's that changeable, understandable. And so sometimes that'll put somebody in that more melancholy range of being, highly unchangeable, but highly emotional about what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
And then that won't be accepted. So you have to deal with how you can change to incorporate that, knowing that she can't accept what it is, right?
Yeah.
It's rad. Let's talk a little bit more about Carl Jung's introversion versus extroversion. I'm sorry, I got walking across me here. Blue, get out of here, buddy. Sorry, I'm at my mother-in-law's place, and my mother-in-law's gone, and her cats are starved for attention. So, yeah. So introverts, extroverts,
Yeah.
right? The most misunderstood thing in life. You are not one.
Mm-hmm.
You are both.
Yep.
And this is where we have to be careful about how we use these. Introverts and extroverts can be best described as how they take energy out of things and where they're gaining energy. Introverts very much gain energy within themselves. Okay, so here you're talking about somebody whose true self
Mm-hmm.
cannot gain as much extension away from themselves. So if you think about those thresholds again, true self being in the middle, introverts can only go so far.
Yeah.
Before there's almost risk of losing true self.
Yes.